We're back with the Busted Halo Show.
Come on. No, really.
Here's Father Dave.
You're on the Busted Halo Show here on a Monday, and in a little while we'll hear from you and hear what you heard, what your experience was of Sunday Mass this weekend. But for now, we're really interested in what our next guest has to say. There's been a good amount, obviously, in the last couple of months, a good amount of people experiencing isolations intentionally, either chosen by themselves or mandated by some authority, and a good deal of loneliness. So joining us this evening is Dr. Josh Packard. He is Executive Director of Springtide Research Institute. He's an accomplished researcher and academic with an expertise in the sociology of religion and new forms of religious expression. He's a talented speaker and writer. He's been a guest on numerous radio and TV shows and podcasts. He's published widely in academic and popular outlets, including Christianity Today, The Huffington Post, Desert News, and Christian Science Monitor, among others. But he joins us tonight to discuss some new research on how social distancing heightens loneliness. Welcome to the Busted Halo Show, Dr. Josh Packard. How are you? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't unmute you. My fault. I have to press the buttons. Hey, Josh, thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I like that. I assume this is your research lab that we're looking at you in, and there's a giant sign that says "Work hard and be nice."
Yeah, this is my home office turned co-working space now with my 10-year-old on the other side of the screens and my wife behind him.
Oh, really? Oh, so you're doing like school and stuff?
I mean, we're doing it all, right? We're on the stay-at-home order, so my wife is, her job has been remote, mine is too, and of course my son's doing homeschooling now. So yeah.
So was the work hard and be nice poster there before the quarantine, or is that to remind your 10-year-old to do those things?
It now serves a dual purpose. That sign has been up for a while.
Okay, all right. It means more now. Okay.
Yes, that's right.
So you're in Greeley, Colorado.
That's right.
And tell us a little bit. I've read over some of your research findings, but sketch out for our listening audience. You had done a good amount of this particular research about isolation and loneliness even before this whole coronavirus thing hit, right? Why was that an interest of your institute?
It was actually, at Springtide, it was actually what we decided to make our very first study. So our focus is on the intersection of the spiritual, religious lives and the daily lives of 13 to 25-year-olds. So we recognize that so much of this age group especially is asking what are essentially religious questions, but they're doing it maybe not in the traditional institutional contexts that maybe you or I had.
Almost assuredly not.
Yeah, but we kept hearing that they were really interested in the same kinds of things, and so we decided to take on as our first study how this sort of context of loneliness and isolation, because the youngest generations are, for the first time ever, the most isolated, the most lonely that we've ever seen, which is startling. And we wanted to know what that impact was on their spiritual lives. So we did a lot of this research back in the fall, and then we updated the study right during the first stay-at-home orders.
Tell me if this is a good place to start. Should we talk about just those two terms that you're using, loneliness and isolation? Are those synonyms? Are those different?
Yeah, they're different. You can measure them both at the same time, but they are slightly different but related constructs. So just because you're isolated doesn't mean you're lonely. But because you're lonely doesn't mean you're isolated. But for the most part, for many people, they tend to go hand in hand. Young people are sort of strange in the sense that, generally speaking, not in the time of COVID, but in the rest of their lives, they don't tend to be very isolated. But even if they're around lots of people, they often feel lonely. And that's sort of counterintuitive to what you think of when you think of the dominant image of a teenager or somebody in their early 20s with their phone, with their head buried in their phone on these social networks all the time. And yet the data shows that these aren't leading to the kinds of relationships that they really want to be having.
So isolation would be more of a physical or geographical description, and loneliness is more of an emotion. Is that?
Yeah, sometimes. But it's really, isolation is about how much you feel included. Like how often do you feel like are you in groups? So one of the weird things that we found in the study, and we wrote this up in a report we call Belonging, Reconnecting America's Loneliest Generation, was that even when young people are a part of groups, it doesn't do anything necessarily to change their loneliness and isolation score. So we had this hypothesis that okay, so even though most young people aren't engaged with church in the traditional sense, those who are definitely feel less lonely and less isolated. And we were really surprised to learn that attending religious services had no impact on their loneliness and isolation scores at all.
Really?
Yeah, none.
So, but you just said that attending did?
So attending didn't matter, but if they attend and they have a relationship with a trusted adult in that space, well, that's a game changer. But just like, so when I was growing up, I think like going to youth group for me was a way of getting connected. It was like, of course I went to youth group. I couldn't possibly be lonely or isolated, but that's not the case today. Young people run around involved in all kinds of things, but not really feeling like they're a part of them, because the way that they sort of signal their loneliness, the way that they experience loneliness and isolation has changed from when, just in the last 20 years.
So what are the factors that would affect the isolation? You're saying that's not just geographic. One can be physically actually in a group of people. I mean, I'm thinking of the typical high school cafeteria, and there's the the one kid that nobody likes, and yes, they're all around him. Is that what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
We've especially, I think it's not uncommon at all for a lot of people to have these like really, really highly programmed youth experiences where they're involved in sports teams, and they're involved in after school events, and maybe tutoring and choir and church maybe. But that doesn't necessarily lead to a sense like they belong somewhere. And that's a crucial distinction.
And isn't it, I mean, I've my ministry for the last 15 years or more, coming up on 16 years, boy, the quarantine thing is really messing with our sense of time. But for the last 16 years, my ministry that I've been tasked with from the Paul's Fathers, my religious community, is this similar age group that you're talking about, the young adults, that when I started this, you were, still in high school or something, Josh, but when I started this, we were talking about Gen X and then the millennials, and now we got whoever the next one is. But I mean, what I recall and what I seem to hear talked about a lot at conferences or in papers is that, at least for the millennials that are now starting to get a little older, if you look at the other squares in your screen, I think you see two ends of the millennial spectrum there from Brett and Christina. But there's also, because what you're talking about is the belonging piece, and in the context of church and community, this is an important aspect of it for us, because what I've heard is a lot of the research has shown is that the millennial generation does not want to belong, in the sense that they don't want to be labeled. I don't want to say I'm a Democrat or I'm a Catholic or whatever. They don't want to have the belong in that sense. And so, for a while, many of the taglines were, well, they may be believers, but they're not belongers. So what I hear you saying is that there's also part of that is not by choice. Is that what you mean?
Well, yeah, part of it isn't by choice, and and the reason why that shift has primarily occurred is that the world has changed. So the notion that belonging used to come through institutional ties was largely accurate for a really long time. What's happened though in the last, I don't know, we've got data that going back 35 years that this trend started, but it's been really heightened in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, which is that young people especially, and people in general, don't trust institutions anymore like they used to. So institutions aren't a place where people even look to anymore to find an automatic sense of belonging. So membership doesn't mean anything in terms of belonging. Just because you say like, oh, I'm on that team, or I go to that church, or this is my school, that doesn't mean that you necessarily feel any identification with it. The only way that people foster a sense of belonging now is through relationships. And for young people, the data is pretty clear that relationship has to be maybe somewhat counterintuitively with trusted adults, not just with peers. And we were really surprised by that, because we thought that peers were going to lead to a sense of belonging, but it turns out that peers cause just as much sort of strife and trauma and drama as they are a source of comfort, right? What they need are these like steady metronome TikTok relationships with adults that they can trust to run things past and to have a connection with and have some wisdom, because that's what's missing in their lives when those institutional connections fall away.
Dr. Josh Packard is our guest here on the Busted Halo Show. He's the executive director of the Springtide Research Institute. I think what I heard you saying was that you guys are a new research institute, and this is one of your first projects.
Yeah, that's right. Springtide's been around for just about a year now. We've got a book coming up too this summer called Meaning Making, about the 8 values that drive America's newest generations. And then this fall, we'll put out our annual State of Religion and Young People report.
Do you guys work at all or know of the work of the Barna Group?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, very familiar with Barna.
Yeah, so they've a couple of David, I forget his last name, has been on
Kinnaman.
our show. David Kinnaman, he's been on our show a couple of times. And certainly we've, at Busted Halo, we've partnered with them. In fact, I think they did, because they have so much research going back many years, that they were able to parse out some Catholic samplings of their data that they do, of all the Christian various denominations. So, all right, so now we get to, here we are, and we've got a generation that is isolating and lonely. And all of a sudden, our governmental leaders start saying, okay, okay, stay home and stay away from people.
Yeah.
Don't touch anyone. Only communicate via this crazy Zoom thing. So what have you know? You guys, did you guys dig in and start to do some more research since this is happening?
We did. So we've got data from just the first few weeks that stay-at-home orders were being enforced, and I think this is a really good. So there's a lesson here to be learned from what we should be doing during these times of social distancing, but there's a bigger lesson here for what we should be doing even when this is over. What we see in this moment then is when you build like ministries or programs that are designed to engage with young people by leaning into your institutional credentials. So you're going to make this big, event that people are going to come to. Or that you're gonna put them through a program that you design and works on your timeline and not somebody else's, for example. Whatever those programmed responses were that worked for, these were really effective for a very long time, but they rely fundamentally on people trusting your institution, not on trusting.
Would an example be something like, what's the? I just blanked on it. So the Catholic where they play sports and stuff. Oh my gosh.
Focus.
No, going way back, long before Focus. Not the Police Athletic League, but
ACO?
What is it? CYO.
CYO, yeah.
So I mean, that one of the examples you were just giving, Josh, is okay for young people. They get involved. You would just know what CYO is, Catholic Youth Organization, or whatever it's called, and essentially it would be playing sports after school, and you'd go to the CYO, and that was sort of a brand or a name or an institution. Is that an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. Of the kinds of things that used to be these automatic connections. Well, when we have a world built like that, and we have a moment that comes across like this that really relies upon, needs relationship connections, we see just how sort of faulty those systems are. And this is really this lack of relationship connection between trusted adults and young people is the missing link between all these young people running around that we keep hearing about at Springtide saying, asking what are essentially religious questions, and all these intending adults who really want to connect with them but don't know how because they're trying to do this through these traditional institutional means. Let me give you an example from our data. During the stay-at-home orders, 50%, half of young people had tried or were experimenting with some sort of new religious ritual. So whether that's praying more, watching services online, meditating, whatever it was.
Wow.
Now you couple that with a religious world that doesn't know how to connect with them because all their institutional connections are gone. And what we find is that while we've got half of the young people doing these things, they're doing it without the experts in the field, because only 1% of young people had been reached out to by a faith leader. 1%. So that means you've got all these young people trying things, but all the experts who should be there to guide them don't know how to get access to them because their institutional methods are gone.
Well, one of the things that I see within our own church, and I've heard some voices within our church being somewhat self-critical, is that what we have rushed to do, and it's taken 6 weeks, and in fact, I think we found out just earlier today that there's some parishes that only this weekend were finally on board with doing something like live streaming our Sunday services.
Sure.
And there's been success to that, and I think there's been probably some patting ourselves in the back like, whoo, look, hey, we've stepped up and we figured out how to use the camera and all that sort of thing. But I think what I hear you saying, which I'm not surprised because I know of other people that would greatly agree with you, is that that's great, but we have such great potential now to reach people in so many different ways, but we tend to just kind of do what we know. It reminds me a little bit of, we're now in the Easter season, Josh, and the readings that we have at Catholic Mass are about after Jesus rose from the dead and all what the disciples were doing. And they're looking around, they're going, I don't know, what do we do now? And they go, well, let's go fishing. Let's go back to what we know.
Right.
And so what we tend to do is go, oh my gosh, no one can come to church. What should we do? I don't know, point a camera at the altar and let's have Mass. Now, obviously, for us, it is the summit and source of our faith. And for many of our people, they are so yearning for that, like the deer is longing for running streams, that is a service. But I would liken it to how, even if before the time of stay-at-home orders, that if we're only servicing those that show up on Sunday morning at 7:30, the real devout folks, then we're missing something as kind of a missionary church. And it sounds like you're calling us to, okay, great, we got the live stream of the camera pointed at the altar down, but wow, there's so many other ways we should be reaching out. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, and first of all, 7:30, that's early on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. Glad you pointed that out. There's gonna be a lot more technical mishaps at that hour.
That's exactly right.
That's usually the one that we've dropped in terms of the live stream.
Yeah, I
bet. That's just me in my pajamas getting coffee. So when I said there are lessons that we learn here from quarantine that we move then take forward with us, those are the lessons about it forces us to think about really what happens when somebody has a feeling like they belong somewhere. What does that process look like? And we unpack that in belonging. We call it noticed, named, and known. But the key of it like comes down to one simple fact, which is that belonging precedes believing. Okay, and we've known this in sociology for a really long time, and the church gets in trouble every time. It doesn't always get it wrong, but they get into trouble when they start to flip that script on its head, and they start thinking like the belief comes first and the community comes later. But we know that like that's not how groups of people work. Not whether it's with regards to religion, political parties, whether it's a community of like the neighborhood that you live in. A sense of belonging always comes first if you want to create really durable, long-lasting people who share a set of beliefs. And so when we focus only on the belief part, it may look like we've got people who belong for a period of time, but the next time something comes along that's either, it's not a crisis anymore, or there's a better opportunity, or I feel like sleeping at 7:30 in the morning, then that sense of like commitment just sort of falls away, or it's not a high level priority thing anymore. But if you have fostered that sense of belonging first, that community, then people hold each other accountable, and the sense of belief that comes out of that is much more durable.
Again, our guest here on the Busted Halo Show, joining us talking about belonging, belief, but also isolationism, Dr. Josh Packard, the Executive Director of Springtide Research Institute in Colorado. It's all fascinating. I think you're right. It is something that the church across denominations needs to hear. And maybe, when we say church, we could include lots of religions. That's been an interesting, or that's been a part of your study, the sociology of religion. Mm-hmm. Would you say that this is, obviously you guys jumped to say, hey, this is a time to do some research. Is this a time that we should not be just figuring out how to survive until we open the darn churches again, but should this be a time that we're really looking at I don't want to say reinventing ourselves, because religion is also about time-tested, traditions that have been handed on. But do you see opportunity during this time, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a real question of like, do you know what you really care about? And making the distinction between what your core beliefs and values are and what are just modes of delivery. And the places that we've been hearing some really inspiring stories of places that have pivoted their mode of delivery because they're so clear about what their values are and what their beliefs are, that the rest of it, it's easy for them to identify, like, oh, that thing we did on Wednesday nights, that was just a thing we did on Wednesday nights. That's not who we are. Like that event that we were going to have to sort of end the school year, like, that's fine. We'll just have a different kind of event to end the school year, because they know who they are. So they pivoted into doing some things that are really like, there's a local ministry here in where I live that is literally dropping off things at kids' doorsteps, hundreds and hundreds of kids from a staff of like 6 or 7. They have programmed events online in a variety of creative ways all throughout the week. And so what they did was, like, with every package they dropped off, it had a calendar of their events and one highlighted with a personal note that said, I think you'd be interested in this thing. Their numbers went through the roof, right? Wow. Like, that took the place of all of this on-site stuff they were doing, but their clarity was about knowing that their mission wasn't about being on-site. Their mission was about reaching kids at the margins. That's what their particular mission was. And so they're just like, oh, that's just a mode of delivery. Now we just have a new way of reaching kids on the margins.
So when you said that, in your study, 1% of young people, and you're talking about your ages again, is it 13 to 25? So
yeah, that's our focus at Springtide, is 13 to 25.
Teenagers, young adults.
Yeah.
So what you said was 1% of those had been reached out to. How do you mean? Like what the example you just gave, that sort of reach out?
Yeah, anything. So we asked them on the survey, I think the question was actually pretty broad and straightforward, if I recall. It's, has a faith leader reached out to check on you, not your family,
to check on you,
or to check in with you or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I guess we should be doing that, huh?
I think so. Again, if it's that, what the data shows, again, that belonging only happens through a sense of connection with an adult, with a trusted adult. Like, that's the facilitator, that's the key. So making those connections is really vital, for the long-term health of your church. So I agree with you. Like, I wouldn't call it a pivot. Like, this is, if you know what you are and what you care about, then it's just changing your mode of delivery, but it's not asking you to like be something that you're not.
Yeah. And I think particularly in the Catholic Church, we do run into trouble because not run into trouble, but I mean, one of the things that is a stumbling block for what you're describing is that a lot of who we are is tied up in what we do, and what we do is connected to the building and connected to the institution, all that sort of thing. Because I mean, I don't see us, nor do I want us to move away from a sense of sacramentality, but it's interesting, the notion to think about, well, certainly we can still celebrate sacraments, but we need to figure out a way other than somebody's just going to be institutionally connected. And when they get to age 7, they do this sacrament. When they get to age 13, they do this sacrament. How do we engage them in a relationship and celebrate the sacraments?
That's exactly right. And I'll give you, so like, I'm also a professor at the University of Northern Colorado. The thing that we do, to sort of put it in a sacrament perspective, is like, we graduate students. I want my students to pass my classes and graduate school. But that's not the only marker that I care about, right? I know the things that lead to my students completing my course successfully and graduating on time. And those are things like coming to class, showing up prepared, coming to my office hours to check in with me on a regular basis if they're struggling, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like I'm only talking to my students at the end of the semester to give them a final and see if they can pass it, and then like congratulating them when they walk across the stage. Like, that would be crazy, right? So we're doing all of these process-based things that we measure and track and are intentional about, and that we like breathe life into on a regular basis, so we can get also to the thing at the end that we all care about too. And I think it's important for the church to remember that those intermediate process things also matter, and they matter, and without them, you're never going to get to the end goal.
So any particular recommendations for, I mean, a lot of people listening are not, those who make decisions in churches or at that institutional level, but just as us, as members of a community, knowing that we're in a time particularly of isolation and loneliness, is there somebody's maybe listening to us right now on their smart speaker and going, oh, that didn't occur to me. Is there something we can all do for one another?
Yeah, I think that's actually the action items here to start with anyway are really straightforward. I mean, if we're looking at this from a leadership perspective, then I would say, like, let's start measuring what matters. And in a world where institutional trust is at an all-time low and it doesn't seem to be coming back, I'm not sure that measuring nickels and noses is the right way to measure whether or not your ministry is having an impact.
Nickels and noses. That means how much money and how many people are in the
pews? That's what you got. Yeah, that's what. Wow. That's an academic.
Heard that.
That is an academic term that we use. So I would be strong. And I'm like, look, every if there's any youth leaders listening to this, youth directors listening to this, they're like, of course, I've seen this. It's just like part of what I feel like our job at Springtide is to provide ammunition to those people to go to their bosses and say, like, stop holding me accountable to these things that don't matter. Let me do real ministry that's impactful. So that would be one. Like, let's start measuring what actually matters, both in terms of process and outcome. Number two,
and so what would be, give an example, if what doesn't matter is how many kids showed up on Sunday night for youth group, it was 20 instead of 40. So what really matters? Because that's no longer a meaningful metric for connection. Then I would say, like, let's measure how many meaningful conversations we're having with young people throughout the course of a week. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that is an actual meaning. But there are also, like, Search Institute. There are some that are Catholic specific, but Search Institute has some really great frameworks for this. The Institute for Youth Ministry at Princeton has some really great metrics for this about how you develop faith-sustaining relationships with young people. So I would say go to some trusted sources, figure out what the stages are, and are you moving young people through those stages? That's a more meaningful measurement.
Dr. Josh Packard is our guest here on the Busted Halo Show. I'm somewhat curious, if it's not too personal question, what got you interested in this sort of work?
That's a great question. Because,
okay, good. I'm glad.
I've been working in higher ed for a long time, but I've never really, I don't know. It's not that I haven't found a home in higher ed. I certainly have. But I always felt myself drawn more to conversations with people who could actually do things with data. I think there's a really great place for all these big high-level theory conversations. I'm not particularly good at them, number one. And number two, they just weren't sort of what got me fired up. So I love taking the concepts from sociology and the social sciences and translating them out into the real world with some data behind them so people can actually do things.
Well, it is fascinating, but I hope it will be more than just head scratching. Whoa, those academics are giving us some data charts. I mean, I hope that we can maybe motivated by what we see going on around us and the fact that it may be a long time before, who knows if ever, that there's back to what the normal was 3 months ago in terms of institution and gathering and edifices and how do we continue to connect. So this is excellent research. Thank you, Dr. Josh Packard. Appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
I have to say, I don't know if Brett and Christina will agree with me, but I've been somewhat curious during the course of this interview. Our radio listeners can't see, but right behind you, there's something mysterious covered up by those doors. We're dying to know.
The mysterious thing is my living room. Okay.
Those are really blocking out the living room.
Do not look beyond this.
Well, it's where my 10-year-old is likely doing PE class right now or something.
PE class.
That's it.
Yes. Father Dave's doing jumping jacks. We're gonna have an injured host because of your shades.
Host down.
Host down. We got a host down. Work hard, be nice, and don't come in here. It's kind of the message I'm getting from your wall. Yeah.
Oh, Josh, thank you so much for joining us, and keep doing what you're doing. If you need affirmation, allow me to affirm you.
I appreciate that.
It's important work. Important work. Thank you. All right. Well, coming up on the Busted Halo Show, we want to hear from you. That's right. What did you hear? What is your experience of Sunday Mass this weekend, whether it's virtual or you drive up in the parking lot? So keep it here on the Catholic Channel, Sirius XM 129.